Our scripture today comes from the book of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 through 35, and I'll be reading this scripture from the Message version of the Bible. That same day, two of them were walking to the village Emmaus, about 7 miles out of Jerusalem. They were deep in conversation, going over all these things that had happened. In the middle of their talk and questions, Jesus came up and walked along with them, but they were not able to recognize who he was. He asked, "What's this you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" They just stood there long-faced, like they'd lost their best friend. Then one of them, his name was Cleopas, said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what has happened during the last few days?" He said, "What's happened?" They said, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in work and word, blessed by both God and all the people. And then our high priest and our leaders betrayed him, got him sentenced to death and crucified. And we had our hopes that he was the one about to deliver Israel. And it is now the third day since it happened. But now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning they were at the tomb and couldn't find his body. They came back with the story that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of our friends went off to the tomb to check and found it empty, just as the women said, but they didn't see Jesus." Then he said to them, "So thick-headed, so slow-hearted, why can't you simply believe all that the prophets have said? Don't you see that these things had to happen, that the Messiah had to suffer, and only then enter into his glory?" Then he started at the beginning with the books of Moses and went on through all the prophets, pointing out everything in the scriptures that referred to him. They came to the edge of the village where they were headed, and he acted as if he was going on, but they pressed him. "Stay and have supper with us. It's nearly evening. The day is done." So he went in with them, and here is what happened. He sat down at the table with them. Taking the bread, he blessed and broke and gave it to them. At that moment, open-eyed and wide-eyed, they recognized him, and then he disappeared. Back and forth they talked. Didn't we feel on fire as he conversed with us on the road, as he opened the scriptures for us? They didn't waste a minute. They were up and on their way back to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their friends gathered together, talking away. "It's really happened. The master has been raised up. Simon saw him." And then the two went over everything that had happened on the road and how they had recognized him when he broke the bread.
Breathe on me, breath of God, fill me with life anew, that I may love the way you love and do what you would do. Yes, but he was a real man. That was his real name. Circuses and carnivals were always passing through Illinois during my childhood, and I was in love with their mystery. One autumn weekend in 1932, when I was 12 years old, the Dill Brothers combined shows came to town. One of the performers was Mr. Electrico. He sat in an electric chair. A stagehand pulled a switch, and he was charged with 50,000 volts of pure electricity. Lightning flashed in his eyes, and his hair stood on end. The next day I had to go to the funeral of one of my favorite uncles. Driving back from the graveyard with my family, I looked down the hill toward the shoreline of Lake Michigan, and I saw the tents and the flags of the carnival, and I said to my father, "Stop the car." He said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I have to get out." My father was furious with me. He expected me to stay with the family to mourn, but I got out of the car anyway, and I ran down the hill toward the carnival. It didn't occur to me at the time, but I was running away from death, wasn't I? I was running toward life, and there was Mr. Electrico sitting on the platform out in front of the carnival, and I didn't know what to say. I was scared of making a fool of myself. I had a magic trick in my pocket, one of those little ball and vase tricks, a little container that had a ball in it, and you make disappear and reappear. And I got that out and asked, "Can you show me how to do this?" It was the right thing to do. It made a contact. He knew he was talking to a young magician. He took it, showed me how to do it, gave it back to me. Then he looked at my face and said, "Would you like to meet those people in that tent over there, those strange people?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I would." So he led me over there and he hit the tent with his cane and he said, "Clean up your language, clean up your language." He took me in, and the first person I met was the illustrated man. Isn't that wonderful? The illustrated man. He called himself the tattooed man, but I changed his name later for my book. I also met the strong man, the fat lady, the trapeze people, the dwarf, and the skeleton. They all became characters. Mr. Electrico was a beautiful man. See, because he knew that he had a little weird kid there who was 12 years old and wanted lots of things. We walked along the shore of Lake Michigan, and he treated me like a grown-up. I talked my big philosophies, and he talked his little ones. Then we went out and sat on the dunes near the lake, and all of a sudden he leaned over and said, "I'm glad you're back in my life." I said, "What do you mean?" "I don't know you." He said, "You were my best friend outside of Paris in 1918. You were wounded in the Ardennes, and you died in my arms there. I'm glad you're back in the world. You have a different face, a different name, but the soul shining out of your face is the same as my friend. Welcome back." Now, why did he say that? Explain that to me. Why? Maybe he had a dead son. Maybe he had no sons. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was an ironical jokester. Who knows? It could be that he saw the intensity with which I live. Every once in a while, at a book signing, I see young boys and girls who are so full of fire that it shines out of their face, and you pay more attention to that. Maybe that's what attracted him. When I left the carnival that day, I stood by my carousel and I watched the horses running around and around to the music of beautiful Ohio, and I cried. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I knew something important had happened to me that day because of Mr. Electrico. I felt changed. He gave me importance, immortality, a mystical gift. My life was turned around completely. It makes me cold all over to think about it, but I went home, and within days, I started to write. I've never stopped. 77 years ago, and I've remembered it perfectly. I went back and saw him that night. He sat in the chair with his sword. They pulled the switch, and his hair stood up. He reached out with his sword and touched everyone in the front row, boys and girls, men and women, with the electricity that sizzled from the sword. When he came to me, he touched me on the brow and on the nose and on the chin, and he said to me in a whisper, "Live forever." And I decided to. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me.
I want to talk with you today about two conversations, two stories. One that takes place on the road to Emmaus, and the other that takes place on the shores of Lake Michigan. The first comes to us from the Gospel of Luke. It occurs 3 days after the crucifixion, and it involves two men who are walking on the road to Emmaus. One of those men goes unnamed, so almost immediately we know that some things might be missing from this story. The named person is Cleopas. Cleopas was shrouded in mystery, so we don't really know much of anything about him. But one theory is that he was the brother of Joseph. Yes, that Joseph, the husband of Mary, the father of Jesus. But we don't know for sure. The geography is also wrong in Luke. Emmaus was not 7 miles from Jerusalem at that time, but it was 20 miles from Jerusalem. The timing of the day is also confusing. Does it matter that Luke gets some of these details wrong and others are missing? Hold that thought for a minute. Back to the story. Cleopas and his companion are talking as they walk along. They're trying to figure out what was happening in their lives, what they had seen and heard recently. And then as they are talking, another begins to walk alongside them. They did not recognize that this person was Jesus at first. When we talk, especially about things that matter, we are creating an opening for change and an opportunity for growth to emerge. This is why Jesus so often told parables, more often told parables than gave commandments, because he wanted to invite us into a conversation with him. But note that Jesus begins by listening, before asking, eventually, what's this you're discussing so intently as you walk along? Cleopas says, are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what's happened during the last few days? And Jesus asks, well, what's happened? Now the Spirit starts to do its work. If Cleopas had more fear than Christ in him, he might have said, never mind, and moved on. Let's not forget that at this point, the early followers of Jesus were beginning to feel hunted and concerned about their safety. So he might have decided this was not a good time to share what he was talking about with a stranger. But instead, he cannot contain himself. He blurts out the things that happened to Jesus, the Nazarene. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in work and word, blessed by both God and all the people. And then our high priest and our leaders betrayed him and got him sentenced to death, and he was crucified on a cross. And we had our hopes up that he was the one about to deliver Israel. That grief-stricken last line. And we had our hopes up that he was the one who was about to deliver Israel. High hopes dashed. We know how that feels as human beings. We had hoped that cancer would go into remission. We had hoped that relationship could be restored. We had hoped we would find forgiveness from someone we had harmed. We had hoped she would not die. We had hoped war would not happen. We had hoped COVID-19 might not be so bad. High hopes dashed. This is the thing about Jesus they're really talking about on that road to Emmaus. Disappointment, regret, sorrow, unspeakable grief. Life had not changed in the way they thought it would with Jesus. But Cleopas goes on. Now the words may do like they sometimes do when we are really in grief. They come pouring out of him, it feels like. And he says, and now it's the third day since all this happened. And now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning, they were at the tomb and they couldn't find his body. They came back with the story that they had seen a vision of an angel who said that he was alive. And some of our friends went off to the tomb to check, and they did indeed find that that tomb was empty, just as the women said. But they didn't see Jesus. More disappointment and confusion. Then Jesus responds, probably astounded that the word of the women, the first evangelist he sent out to share the good news with the world, that their words were not believed. And so Jesus sets the spiritual record straight with Cleopas and his friend. He says, so thick-headed, man, so slow-hearted. Why can't you simply believe all that the prophet said? Don't you see that these things had to happen? That the Messiah had to suffer and only then enter into his glory? No answer from Cleopas and his friend. I can imagine them looking down at the road, listening, partly thinking, perhaps this man is right. Maybe we should rethink this all. Maybe we have misjudged the situation. And partly thinking, But then again, what does this guy really know? We were with Jesus. We know that he's dead. So they keep walking, the three of them, now in silence. Jesus has said what he had to say, and he is waiting to see if there is any reaction, for it is a conversation that he seeks after all. But seeing no response, he prepares and starts to move on. Now, the Spirit is like that, you know. Sometimes if we're not ready, sometimes God just moves on. Doesn't mean that God is finished with us, but it does mean that in that moment we were not ready for the Spirit of God to do its work in us. But in these two men, the Spirit of God was at work. And so they said to this strange man they had encountered, "Hold up, man, stay with us. It's almost evening and the day is nearly over. Let's continue the conversation." So Jesus stayed. Of course he stayed. He didn't need to be convinced to stay. He just needed to be invited. It's that way with God's Spirit too. Sometimes we really do need to say, "God, please help us where we are in our moment of confusion and pain and suffering that we don't understand." And here's what happened. The man sat down at the table with them, and he took the bread. He blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. Sound familiar? And at that moment, open-eyed, wide-eyed, they recognized him. And then he disappeared. And back and forth they talked. Didn't we feel on fire as he conversed with us on the road, as he opened up the scriptures for us? They agreed. Now, to our other story. This week, I learned the story of an unlikely spiritual teacher named Mr. Electro. If you are a Ray Bradbury fan, you may know him. He was a character in one of his many great stories. But as Ray Bradbury loved to tell people when he would tell this story, Mr. Electro was a real man. Just like even 2,000 years later, we sometimes have to remind people, but Jesus was a real man. Not just a myth, not just a legend. It's the story Lori read for you a few minutes ago. The story stands on its own, and I will email it to you later, shared in an interview done by my friend Sam Weller. Sam is Bradbury's official biographer, and the story was shared in a 2010 interview Sam did with Bradbury for the Paris Review. And I immediately, when I heard the story, saw similarities between the story Luke tells us and the story Ray Bradbury tells. Both have an out-of-time quality to them. Yet at the same time, each story contains piercingly clear and authentic spiritual truth. And there are things that don't make sense or information missing in both stories. Sam himself has spent years trying to track down more about the real Mr. Electrico. And some of what he gathered, hard information, facts, if you will, contradict Bradbury's memories about things like when this actually happened and who was this actual man. Things that seem to be in contest with the memories, the recall Ray Bradbury had of this conversation as a 12-year-old boy with a mysterious carnival worker. Just as so many generations of scholars have pointed out inconsistencies in the remembrances of Jesus that make up our New Testament. Does it matter that Luke got some of the details wrong, or some of the information that we'd like to know in the story are missing? Does it matter that Bradbury did? Is spiritual truth the same as literal truth? Is it built on just the facts? Or is spiritual truth something more? What makes a conversation sacred? Is it the details, just a transcript of the words, or is it something more about the words themselves? When Sam was kind enough to talk with me by phone last night about this story, he said that he described Ray as always on fire when he told the story. A fire, Sam said, that Bradbury felt compelled to share with others by telling that same story to others. Now, what did Cleopas and his friends say? They said that they felt on fire as they conversed with Jesus, and it opened their eyes to his presence when he broke bread with them. And what did they do next? Not a minute later, they got back on that road to Emmaus, turned right back towards Jerusalem to tell their brothers and sisters what they had seen with fire in their eyes. Real, honest to goodness, spiritual truth is like that. What I like about the way Bradbury tells the story is he's not telling us what to believe or who to be. He's just telling us a story about someone who changed his life profoundly. Oh, how I wish that more Christians shared their faith this way. Not by telling people what to do or who to be or what to believe, which is the least effective way to bring people along to something. How much better it would be to share as Bradbury did, by showing them who we are, by showing people who we are because of what God has done for us, what God is creating in us in our encounter with the Spirit of Christ. The early church grew for one reason. People told their story about their encounter with Jesus to others. And their stories were personal, real, and told in a way that invited people in so that they might know the fire that had changed them. Just as Ray's story did. Ray's story about a man who helped him through his grief, about a man who treated him as significant, about a man who listened to him, about a man who recognized the soul shining out through his face, a man who baptized him with the words, "Live forever." And that conversation caused that little boy, with tears streaming down his face, to recognize that something fundamentally had been changed for the good in him by this man. And that little boy grew into a man who would indeed live forever through his writing, which he started immediately after meeting Mr. Electro. And even 70 plus years later, he never forgot his conversation with a mysterious man on the shores of Lake Michigan. Just as those blessed people who had the privilege never forgot their conversations with Jesus by his beloved Sea of Galilee. So let me close with just some quick thoughts. First, in my experience, spiritual truth is more often known than proved. Spiritual truth is more often known than proved. Second, conversations matter. And the best conversations are sacred, and they involve the kind of sharing between people that helps people to grow and expand in their knowledge of themselves and their knowledge of God and their purpose in the world. 3. God can and God will speak to us through the most unlikely people, be that a carnival performer on the shores of Lake Michigan or a poor peasant itinerant rabbi from Nazareth. Finally, our lives, every moment of our lives from start to end, are bathed in mystery because life is so much more than what we can see, what we can touch, what we can feel, and what we can know in our brains. On the road to Emmaus, 2 grief-stricken fellows were met by the Spirit of God through Jesus Christ, who helped them find their way to new life. At a carnival in Waukegan, Illinois, in 1932, a little boy named Ray Bradbury, who was grief-stricken at the loss of his dear Uncle Lester, the victim of a late-night armed robbery, was helped to find his way by the Spirit of God speaking through a carnival performer named Mr. Electro to help him find new life and lifelong purpose. It makes sense to me. Yeah, Luke got it right. So did Ray. Thanks be to God. Amen.